Hi, my name is Delaney Weisel, and this is my media clip final project. So my first slide talks about learning disabilities. These can include reading disabilities, dyslexia, and math disabilities. The first I will discuss is reading disabilities. So students who have a reading disability can experience challenges in certain reading-related tasks, such as phonetic analysis, word identification, reading fluency, or reading comprehension. Challenges for students with learning disabilities, such as a reading disability, can be that the students sometimes have their emotional needs overlooked. This can be easy because the student might not portray that they're struggling, especially if they're working on another subject. Students with learning disabilities have also been reported to have higher depression rates, can be more anxious, or can even, they might even act out more. So, mathematical disabilities usually present themselves through procedural problems or fact retrieval. And then students with learning disabilities might also have memory problems. This can affect short-term, long-term, or even working memory. These problems, and then they say that most learning disabilities come from genetics, but some environmental factors could also probably be a cause. Students with learning disabilities have been seen to have higher inclusion rates than students with other disabilities, but ways to better help include students with learning disabilities would be to match them with a peer tutor that could help them, or you could even use differentiated instruction to obviously meet their needs, or you could allow the students with the learning disabilities to be a tutor in an area that they do very well in. And that would obviously make them feel important in the classroom and make them feel like they're contributing. Let's see. Ways that would allow for students to have the universal design for learning implemented would be to give different options for their instruction. That way, that can better fit their needs, and they can better feel like they are receiving an education, and that they will be learning if you give them different options from learning, because every student does not obviously learn the same way. So my next slide is communication disorders. There are speech and language disorders, and they are when students have disability making sound or have poor voice quality. They might also have poor speech fluency. There are two types of language disorders, receptive and expressive. Receptive is when a student does not understand the information that is given to them, and expressive is when students have a hard time formulating ideas. Students with communication disorders may need a speech-language pathologist, but there are steps to go through to that. And there are also two types of speech and language disorders. There's organic and functional. Organic is when you know what the cause is, and then functional is not. So students who present communication disorders are either given a screening, a referral, or both, and this determines whether they need a speech-language pathologist. And then if they do get a speech-language pathologist, this person takes records from the student, sees how they're learning, and then uses that to assess whether they have a communication disorder and whether that is affecting their learning. Assistive technology can be helpful for students with communication disorders. AAC devices or augmentative and alternative communication can transmit or receive messages, or can help with gesturing, speaking, or writing. These devices can be communication books, communication or language boards, communication charts, etc. There's many different options to choose from. Ways to implement the universal design for learning would be to allow them to express themselves in different ways, and this allows for students, to be able to feel like they don't just have to contribute. You don't always have to have discussions in your classroom. You can have students write something on a piece of paper and turn it in. There's just many different ways for students to express themselves and to communicate with you, for them to show you that, they're learning. My next slide talks about emotional and behavioral disorders. So there are many different kinds of emotional disorders. There's anxiety, mood, oppositional, defiant, conduct, and schizophrenia. Behavioral disorders present themselves through externalizing behavior or internalizing behavior. Externalizing is disruptive, can be aggressive. Internalizing might cause a student to withdraw. Emotional and behavioral disorders can be caused by genetics, and students with these disorders can be helped in school by receiving service learning, which allows them to do community service and can actually promote higher self-esteem and enhance leadership and communication skills. Students with behavioral and emotional disabilities can be included in the classroom more by doing cooperative work and having structured controversy like a debate where you're the mediator, and teaching mediation and negotiation and incorporating group problem solving. Ways to implement the universal design for learning for this would be to give students many different options for self-regulation. That way, if one option doesn't work, they can de-escalate by using another option in your classroom. Because obviously not all ways work for this one student. Oops. I'm sorry. Nope, we're good. Okay. Yeah. ADHD. Students with ADHD can display many different characteristics, some of which could be, this would be, inattentive, to where they're paying attention, but they aren't, interpreting the information they're receiving. And then there's also hyperactive, where they may have trouble standing still in line or waiting their turn, or they could present a combination of these two different symptoms. Ways to help students with ADHD is to allow them to receive medication if that's what it comes to. There is also behavioral therapy that they try to work with before the student receives medication. Their parents also need to know how to help with their child with the behavioral treatments, and then using effective classroom management skills is key to also helping these students. And then ways to implement the universal design for learning for students with ADHD would be to provide multiple means of engagement. That way, if you have inattentive and you have hyperactive, you have different engaging points, because if a student is not engaged, they are not going to learn and you are not going to have success in your classroom. Intellectual disabilities. So students with intellectual disabilities usually have memory problems. They also might have problems generalizing skills or applying one skill set to another. So this could mean they might have problems taking their math and applying it to the science that they're doing. There's also not one single cause of an intellectual disability, and there are many ways to include students with intellectual disabilities. Some of the ways are to teach self-regulation, so if they have problems, de-escalating from situations, this would obviously benefit your whole class, but more so students with intellectual disabilities. You could also teach community-based instruction, which would again allow for that community service to come in, and they might have higher self-esteem in the end, and it might promote their leadership skills. And then ways to implement the universal design for learning would be to teach many different ways of self-regulation, because obviously they're going to have a hard time with this, and that you're also helping the other students out by doing this as well. The next slide talks about autism, and there are three main things that need to be present in students that have autism, that are classified as having autism. Students will have problems with social emotional reciprocity and nonverbal communication and maintaining relationships. So students with autism are shown to have low rates of inclusion in classrooms, so providing students with social stories might help them better relate to their peers, or might help their peers relate to them better as well. It's just kind of it'll go back and forth. It's very beneficial. Also, making sure your classroom is positive, give students positive behavior supports, making sure that no one's tearing anyone down in your classroom. Ways to implement the universal design for learning would be to provide options for sustaining effort and persistence, which could help promote collaboration. You always want your students to work together. You want them to learn how to work together with each other, which could be very beneficial in promoting group support. The next one is traumatic brain injury. So students with traumatic brain injury, they're not born with them, but they acquire them after they're born. And so they all have very different characteristics, and their injury could affect many different aspects of their lives. They usually share many of the same characteristics with students that have learning disabilities. To help students with traumatic brain injury experience success in the classroom, it may be helpful for teachers to incorporate different cooperative learning strategies, for students to work together. And then as the student ages, their injury may heal, but they may still suffer from problems, and teachers can make sure to teach problem-solving skills, which would better ready them for the real world when they get out there. And then to better include students with traumatic brain injury, teachers need to allow students to obviously work on their problem-solving skills. So this could mean giving them different scenarios and, allowing them to work with their students and work through disagreements. And, obviously that would all benefit all of the class, but students with traumatic brain injury especially. Ways to implement the universal design for learning would be to provide multiple means of engagement, because obviously you're still going to have that some students are affected this way, some students are affected that way, so I need to make sure everyone is engaged. That way they can all learn from my lesson. Hearing loss is when students may have language delays, and the severity of these delays depends primarily on the child. So the difficulties that students with hearing loss have, they have to do with speaking and reading and writing. To ensure that the students have success in their classrooms, if they have hearing loss, is to be able, you need the early intervention, because that's obviously critical. And then parents also need to know, what exactly, how severe their child's hearing loss is, to be able to make decisions later on regarding their child's future. And they also need to make sure, parents and teachers need to make sure their students and their children are in language-rich environments, that they just hear a lot of language and they see a lot of language. So, I mean, this could mean labeling things. It could mean, visual aids. And then, because the more a student with hearing loss is introduced to language and helped with language, the better off they are in getting a job, because employment rates are very low among students with hearing loss. And then ways to better include students with hearing loss would be to use a buddy system, or to pair them up with someone who's very caring but not, overbearing or mothering. And then ways to implement the universal design for learning would be to provide multiple means of action and expression. And this would allow for the student to use sign language, or use the braille that use their sign language, or, use regular speaking, or just, obviously express themselves in very different ways, whatever is helpful to them and whatever they can use to get their point across. Visual impairments. So students who have visual impairments have very different characteristics from one another, and some are even gifted students, but a large number of students with visual impairments have multiple disabilities. And despite all the differences, students with visual impairments have one main characteristic, and that's how they're limited to how much they can learn from the environment around them. Having a TV eye for students would be very helpful, because they would be able to change material to braille if the student needs it, or put raised lines on maps. It's very helpful to have this type of teacher in a classroom for students with visual impairments. So ways to implement the universal design for learning would be to provide multiple means for action and expression, which would allow for the student to use the assistive technologies that are given to them, which would in turn increase the success that they have in their classroom. Because if they don't have the option to use these assistive technologies, they're really not going to do as well. Finally, students who are gifted and talented, they have differing characteristics, but usually share a few of them, which could be high general intellect, specific academic aptitudes, strong creativity and leadership ability, and there's even more characteristics that they share. Teachers need to use Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences to apply to students who are gifted and talented, because they need to learn that even though these students are very smart, they all still have different areas in which they are smart. And so teachers need to match the student's skill level and make sure that they are providing challenging opportunities and giving them enrichment strategies as well. As students age, teachers need to promote creativity and make sure to implement critical thinking strategies. To better include students who are gifted and talented, teachers can implement a way for students to come up with questions and allow the gifted students to work on these with their peers, which would, obviously give that critical thinking opportunity a chance. And then teachers can also see whether it would be a good idea if the students should attend classes in the next grade. Implementing the universal design would be to provide means of engagement so that the student could have varying levels of challenging activities. They're not just sitting there paying attention, not being challenged. That obviously creates a very bored student. And then these are my resources. Thank you for listening.